little kids, by the time they are strong enough to walk, they're carrying their own siblings. They are caring for their own. And so age does not determine the social abilities of children in many of your contexts. So we have, again, to think seriously about that. When we think of youth, we also have to apply the same critiques. How do we move away from the notion of age-determined social roles, when most of our social roles are determined by context, by family structure, by location, whether it's in the rural or urban communities, and by the practices of mixed economies. So let me give you, that's general. So on the one hand, we've seen that there have been challenges of research that have said African children and youth are much more complex and vulnerable and out of control. We've talked about the ability to move away from a universal definition of youth, of children. Now, let me give you two approaches that I think have been coming up in all the literature that I've seen, especially as we look at how African youth can be studied, represented, and written about. There are two of them. The first one is what I would call an Afrocentric framing. By Afrocentric, I mean starting with Africa as the center of your research imagination. You're not only looking at how children and youth are defined and understood, but also how best to understand and write them as Africans. Framing your research from an Afrocentric standpoint starts that with the assertion that Africans are subjects and agents of their own lives. Subjects and agents of their own lives, as opposed to being objects within a larger global reference point. So they are subjects and agents of their own lives, opposed to being objects. Both the subject and the object of research are culturally and socially immersed in a shared ethos. So you as a researcher and the youth that you're working with share a common social cultural ethos. So this throws off our idea of the objectified observer sitting on a high desk somewhere seeing what things are happening down there among the subjects. You are really involved in the research itself. And 50 years ago, with the positivist movement, this was seen as bad research. But now we do know and understand that all research is positioned. The questions you ask, the issues you focus on are all determined by something about you or about your research community. So from an Afrocentric point of view, you're saying, I am in this. And looking at you, many of you have gone through some of the issues that you're researching as individuals. The issues that you're looking at are part of your lives. You cannot say, oh, no, let me just stand on this high pedestal and look at those children or these young people. No. Some of you are in the universities that you're studying. You are women that are studying gender issues. You are music enthusiasts that are studying what music is doing. You are involved in cities that need to do waste management. You are involved in education system that you want to understand. You are part of the subject, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is your strength, because your subjectivity allows you to be focused on the key issues. And now the theoretical training allows you to become more discerning of the issues that you need to tease out and the analysis that you provide. So that's the first approach. The second approach is what I consider to be the in-depth qualitative research. In-depth qualitative research. And this might be a bias because I'm an anthropologist. And we like to carry out what we call thick descriptions of cultural phenomena. There are many research methods that we can engage in, but engaging in in-depth qualitative research allows us to support the first approach by letting our local realities inform the outcomes of our study, especially in framing the right kinds of questions. Let me now expand on a few, on these two movements and, or approaches by offering some few examples. As you know from our presentations yesterday, CODESRIA is very much interested in promoting, developing, and disseminating African knowledge of African realities and framing them within the larger global research agenda. This has been the goal and mission of CODESRIA since its inception in 1973. But there are also individuals that have been very involved in this, and I'll just give one example. And this is a Cameroonian psychologist named Bame Nsamenang. Bame runs a nonprofit organization dedicated to research on the human family, the African family, and childhood, and has research that looks at how the subjective study of African childhood has to be located within the Afrocentric research paradigm. And he argues that Western-derived theories and research practices that are almost always applied uncritically in African research lead to confusion and often produce evidence that does not serve Africans well. In his critique of his colleagues, especially in the Euro-American context, Nsamenang argues that Western views on human development and intelligence have been presented as applicable to all human diversity, even though they greatly differ with an African worldview. In an African worldview, he argues, knowledge is not separated into discrete disciplines, but is rather interwoven into a common tapestry, learned in a participatory curriculum. So even the socialization of youth and children within an African context cannot be separated into different categories. That has been an interesting tension, because when you come with research questions that have been very successful within a Western context, they will not fit very well within the African context. And let's take an example of trying to, in the West, there is something we call the separation of state and religion, okay? Where you can deal with your religious practices in one sense and your national public issues on the other. I'm sure within your own faith traditions, you can think of no places where these are so separate. And so when you come to think in theoretical ways, you're always confused. when do I start being this and when do I stop being that? Rather than say, well, that worldview will not fit here, you start to squeeze in things from your research to fit this model that has come from elsewhere. Bame says, no. We have to be informed in our own theoretical thinking by the worldviews that inform our lives every day. And those are, in a sense, very unique. We have to be very careful not to fall into also research methods that start with the individual as the smallest unit of analysis. But let me also offer a word of caution here as well. Even as we critique our Western researchers' construction of African children and youth, we also might be careful not to find an essentially African definition of what constitutes youth. So we don't want to critique one presentation and then fall into, oh, we say, okay, all African children are like this. All African youth are like this. No. We also want to use the same critique to make sense of our own social realities. So we understand that there's something very uniquely African about our social lives. But that's the larger part of it. When you come down, what are the unique practices that we see in the unique places that you live? Social scientists tell us that these unique practices will also be enabled by how we define and think of youth and children. What are some of the ways in which we define youth and children? Do we define them by age limits? Do we define them by the kinds of work they do? Do we define them within structures and institutions such as family, as school? Do we define them by the work that they are able to do? How do we account for even differences between families within the same society? Those are the kinds of questions. And the answers to those will come from, remember the two ideas of how do you frame your questions and what's the reality on the ground. As a researcher, it's important to think of yourself as both a practitioner of the social life you're observing and also as an observer of the same life that you are engaging with. So you have a very interesting position here. On the one hand, you are one of the people, that are being influenced by whatever social forces and opportunities that you see youth in. But also, you want to use and wear your scholarly hat and say, what really is going on? Because many times, we as human beings are socialized into a culture over a long period of time so that we are not able to identify the specifics of why we do what we do. Why do we have rice and fish for breakfast in Liberia and not fufu or ugali? You can't explain, but it's just, you say, this is what we do. Yeah, because over time, you've been socialized step by step. But now, as a researcher, you're starting to ask questions that are almost unasked in your everyday life. So you're wearing these two hats. You're a practitioner of this culture, and yet you're asking questions because those questions will allow us to understand better the lives we live and project what we can face in the future. My second point on doing ethnographic research moves now, as we're saying that as Africans, we have something of value to offer. We are coming from a position of knowledge. We are coming from a position of uniqueness, and yet not falling into the same challenges of universalizing our Africanity and saying that this Africanness also needs to be nuanced and made much more complex because of our lived experiences. Currently, most research on children and youth in Africa seems to be limited by the lack of what I call sustained ethnographic research that would not only recognize some of these blind spots, but also capture the innovation, fluidity, and experiences of people that are lived both as individuals within families and also communally as a society. Studies of African children and youth will benefit from ethnographic research that produces what, as I mentioned, thick descriptions. These are nuanced understandings of social realities and practices that are often missed by approaches that start with assuming that there are experiences that are universal and understanding of youth as one block. That was the universal, you know, and by universal, you mean Western. And long-term research by Robert Levine worked in Western Kenya among the group called the Kisi. They found what would be psychologically called weak mother-infant relation because the mothers ignored the children when they're crying. The mothers were harsh to the children when they responded to them. But because of conducting research over 20 years, the researchers were able to follow those young people and realize they had very healthy lives when they grew up. And therefore, debunked the idea that if you treat children in this way, they will come out this way. That's the value of long-term research. You're able to say, wait a minute, I saw these children 5 years ago, and they have moved on. And I think there's a story, I don't know if it's Elizabeth's story, in one of the women that lived in a slum, and is now sort of in the corporate sector. So if you just focus on that specific slice of life, you miss out on all